So today we're going to talk about housing of photographic materials for storage and exhibition, so thank you all for coming. So I'm Amanda Maloney, and I'm the Associate Photograph and Paper Conservator from the Northeast Document Conservation Center, which is also known as NEDCC. And it's a conservation center located in Massachusetts, but we work with clients all across the country doing physical treatment of objects and then also doing outreach such as this type of presentation today, and are happy to give advice to institutions such as yours. So you should feel free to use us as a resource and reach out to me individually. My email is there, and then other people at my organization too are very happy to work with institutions such as yours. So today my goal with this presentation is to hopefully provide you with a broad base of understanding about the types of materials that are used for photographic enclosures so that you can make informed decisions for your collection. I'll go through some specific examples, and then at the end we should finish up with time to look at some examples that I brought today, because I feel like looking at things hands-on can be very helpful. And there'll be times for question and answer at the end, but if as I'm going through anybody has any questions, I'm happy to entertain them as we move along. So if anything is unclear, just feel free to raise your hand and ask. So this presentation today is a follow-up from a presentation that my colleague Monique Fisher, who's the Senior Photographic Conservator at NEDCC, gave last year at ATALM on photographic process identification. And some of you may have attended that, I'm not sure. And some of you may feel very confident in your skills at identifying different types of photographic processes. And some of you might want to build those skills a bit too. And these are some good resources for that. NEDCC offers webinars in addition to in-person workshops. So you can check back on that and see if any of those are happening. And we also have free informational leaflets on our website, which the address is there. The Graphics Atlas website is also a great website for process ID. They have photographs of photographs that are under certain types of magnification, different types of lighting, even cross sections. So it's very useful for learning how to look closely at photographs to get a good sense of being able to identify the different processes. And the last two resources are print books, which are both excellent, and I'd highly recommend them for your research library. So just to sort of briefly talk about photographic processes, sort of what you need to know for this lecture today is that they're complicated structures. They're a laminate structure. So they have a support, which can be paper, plastic, glass, or metal. They may have a binder, which is usually gelatin, collodion, or albumin. Some photographs don't have a binder. And then there's the image material, which can be silver metal, dyes, pigments, or other types of metals. Now, because there are so many different materials involved in a single photograph, you really have to think about balancing the needs of each of those individual materials for what is going to be best for that photograph. And so thinking about housing and finding good housing solutions for your collections is going to be balancing a lot of different needs. So there's the needs of the individual photograph, which we just talked about a little bit, and also thinking about how the collection is going to be used, how frequently it's going to be used, who is using it, the level of skill of the people that are involved with handling the materials and the level of supervision they'll have handling them. And obviously a budget for supplies is always a big consideration. Then also thinking about labor, thinking about who's going to be doing the housing. Is it going to be volunteers? Is it going to be full-time staff? And again, the issues of time and money for that aspect of it. And additionally, space for storage, making sure that the housing solutions that you are implementing in your collection are making the best use of the space that you have available. Now, the reason why we want proper housing is to help preserve our photographs in our collections for as long as we possibly can. And proper housing will help mitigate changes in the environment by essentially insulating the objects sort of buffering them from major changes that are happening around them. Proper housing also can encourage proper handling. So that's in the design of the housing that's being used. And also partly psychologically, when you are handing something to a researcher that clearly has been put into a nice housing, they're going to treat that object with more respect than if you just sort of give them a box of stuff. The housing obviously provides physical protection, and it can also provide chemical protection. And in this presentation, I'll talk a little bit more about the specific types of chemical protection that can be provided with the right housing materials. So, as I was saying, they can help, proper housing can help mitigate changes in the environment, and we like to think of this sort of like, the Russian nesting dolls, where you want to have as many layers of protection as possible are going to keep your object as safe as possible. And we talk about things having a primary enclosure, a secondary enclosure, a tertiary enclosure. So the primary enclosure is anything that's in direct contact with the object, and a secondary enclosure is anything that primary enclosure is in. Tertiary, anything the secondary enclosure is in. And then thinking about that kind of going out into also the storage furniture you're using, the room that it's in, and your building. And all of those you want to have, the highest quality you possibly can. And also here I think it's important to emphasize that while proper housing can help mitigate some of the changes in the environment, you still want to ensure that your collection has the best possible environment that you can have. And if you ever are having to make a budgetary decision between improving your environment and improving the housing, the environment should always take priority. So looking at housings, often the first kind of decision to make is whether to use paper or plastic. There's some obvious differences between them. Plastic is transparent, which can be a benefit if you have an item that is frequently accessed, because researchers can look at it and get the information they need from it without having to directly handle the object itself. So it provides an extra layer of protection for that object while allowing people to see that object. Paper is much easier to write on than plastic. Really, pencil's the only thing that I would recommend for labeling housings or objects themselves. So paper is preferable for that. Paper is also permeable, so it breathes, which is important for objects you have that might be off-gassing. You don't want to necessarily trap them in a plastic enclosure where they're going to be exposed to the materials that they're off-gassing and accelerate their deterioration. Plastic is very smooth. However, it's important to note that it often has a static charge to it. So if you have materials that are very fragile, if they're torn, or if they're flaking, or have hand-applied media that might be friable, you probably don't want to use plastic with those, because there is a good chance that the static charge of the plastic could actually pull at those loose areas and make them worse. Now, paper can contain buffers or zeolites, and I'll talk about specifically what those are a little bit later and when you would want to use those. Plastic is something you need to be a little bit cautious with if you know you have humidity issues, specifically a high elevated humidity, because if they're in enclosures, especially if they're tightly packed in those enclosures, they can stick to the plastic and cause a permanent surface change for gelatin photographs. Now, paper, perhaps one of the biggest benefits to it is it's less expensive usually than the plastic, and it's also very lightweight. So if you have a box of photographs and they're all in plastic enclosures, that's going to be much more heavy and more difficult to handle than one that has paper enclosures. Now, the first thing that I'm going to say to look for when you're buying housing materials is to see that it's passed the photographic activity test, which is known as the PAT. Now, this is a test that was developed at the Image Permanence Institute in Rochester, New York, and they've done a lot of wonderful research into photographic preservation. It is a test that is an international standard. So that means basically a panel of experts has kind of vetted this test, and it's a good test for looking at kind of the chemical interactions that housing materials will have with photographs. Now, that said, it's designed specifically for certain types of photographs, so again, here's where process ID is important. So the standard PAT looks at silver gelatin, which is your typical 20th century black and white print, chromogenic, which is your typical 20th century color print, inkjet prints, both dye and pigment, dye diffusion transfer, which is a generic name for Polaroid, electrophotography, which is a generic name for Xeroxes, and diazos, which are a type of photographic reproduction commonly used for architectural drawings, but occasionally they are also used by artists. Now for the chromogenic materials, you also want to see that it passes the color PAT, which is an additional test which looks specifically at the dye couplers in chromogenic images. And just to help you understand what the PAT is, this is a diagram of the jig they set up to perform the tests. So you have your test samples that are in contact with indicators, and you have control samples. And those are all put under pressure and exposed to elevated humidity and heat. The idea being that you can expose them to those extreme conditions for a short period of time and extrapolate out how they will perform over a long period of time in standard conditions. Things that can be tested by the PAT include paper, plastics, inks, adhesives. So it's all the kind of components that you're looking at for housing materials. That said, it's only looking at the chemical interactions. So whether an enclosure is going to be strong enough, non-abrasive, those kind of things, you will still have to judge for yourself. Manufacturers pay to have the PAT test done on their materials. So they're usually very happy to advertise that they've passed the PAT. And if you're looking through archival supplier catalogs, you usually see it very prominently displayed that these have passed the PAT. Another thing to look for is that the materials are lignin-free. Now, lignins occur naturally in wood pulp, and in nature, we're very happy that they're there. Otherwise, our trees wouldn't grow taller than 2 feet tall because they provide a lot of strength for them. But the problem is when the wood is pulped, they can release acids and peroxides over time, which are very harmful to photographic materials. Now, you can buy papers that are 100% rag, which are made from cotton or linen, which naturally have no lignins in them anyway. And wood pulps now can also be fully delignified. So you want to look for materials that have at least an 87% cellulose content if you're going to be buying wood pulp materials. Now, the other terminology you hear a lot with housing materials is acid-free or alkaline reserve or buffer. And those all refer to pH. So just a quick review of your high school chemistry. The pH scale, pH of 7 is neutral, and so that's like the pH of water. And as the pH gets lower, it's getting more acidic, and as it gets higher, it's getting more basic or more alkaline. Now, the pH scale is a logarithmic scale, so a change in 1 in the pH scale is a change in 10 times. So you can see the list on the left of the pH scale shows the actual degree of change for each one change in pH. So there's a significant change for each step pH. Now, what pH stands for is P is the inverse log, and H is a hydrogen ion. So in acidic solutions, you have a lot of hydrogen. And one of the reasons why we want to avoid it is hydrogen is very good at breaking apart cellulose chains. So the image you see on the right is a chemical diagram of what a cellulose chain looks like. And when the hydrogen is introduced, it actually blows apart those chains. And that's why a lot of times acidic paper feels so weak, because it's actually the chains in that paper have been broken down, so they're much shorter. you want nice, long, strong chains of cellulose in your paper. So buffers, when you see it applied to paper and boards, usually mean that there's an alkaline reserve of 2 to 5% calcium carbonate. And calcium carbonate will help to neutralize those hydrogen ions and maintain a higher pH over time. Having buffered materials is particularly helpful when you have materials such as nitrate and acetate negatives, which are actively off-gassing acidic byproducts. And the buffers can actually help absorb those and thus prolong the life of those negatives. Though there are some photographic processes that do not like to be at a high pH and are sensitive to alkaline materials. So those processes are cyanotypes, also known as blueprints. So you want to be careful about using buffered materials with them. Diazotypes, these are what I mentioned before, which were often used for architectural reproductions, but occasionally, as in this instance, for fine art. And dye transfer or dye imbibition, which was a 20th century color process that's mainly used for commercial or fine art photography, not so much for snapshots. The caution with the buffered materials really becomes more of a concern if the collection went through a disaster and they became wet, because it's in that kind of environment that the actual alkaline materials could transfer and affect the images of the cyanotypes, the dye transfer, the diazotypes. Another substance that can be added to paper and board are called zeolites, and they're microporous aluminosilicate, and they're often called molecular traps or sieves. And that's because, as you can see in this diagram, they're formed with lots of sort of small tubes throughout these molecules. And as gases pass through those tubes, they become very attracted to the inside, and the tubes actually hold them and keep them from moving through the paper or board or material. They can become exhausted over time, and there isn't an exact number of years that you're meant to use them, and it honestly would depend on how actively materials in your collection were off-gassing. And there is some concern that if they became wet, that they could release the materials that they had trapped. As far as I know, though, there isn't any kind of anecdotal evidence of this having happened or what the consequences of it would be. But it's something to keep in mind that if you do choose to use them in your collection, it's probably not a bad idea to monitor them to make sure that they're still active. Some common brands are Art Care, which is a matte board, and Microchamber, which is various weights of paper. So when you're purchasing paper or board to use for your photographs, the first thing you want to look for is see that it passes the PAT, that it's lignin-free, that it has a cellulose content of 87% or greater, or is 100% cotton or rag. You want to decide if it's appropriate for it to have buffers or zeolites. And I also just want to say it's important to realize that the term archival doesn't have any kind of standard meaning to it. It's just an adjective that can sort of be applied to anything. So just because someone says something is archival doesn't necessarily mean it's actually high quality or suitable to use with photographs. Additionally, the term acid-free does have a meaning, and that meaning is that it's 7.5 or higher when it leaves the manufacturer, but there's no guarantee that it will maintain that elevated pH. And sometimes there are things they can do to artificially raise that pH so they can send it out as being acid-free, but it won't maintain that over time. That said, things that are acid-free may be good quality too, but you want to just make sure if it says it's acid-free that it's also 100% cotton, also lignin-free, all those other terms that actually do have solid meaning. Now, papers and boards for storage, you would use them for Interleaving, as in an album, or sometimes if you have multiple objects together in a folder, it's nice to put in some interleaving to help absorb any off-gassing and also protect them from abrasion from adjacent objects. Medium weight papers can be used for making primary enclosures such as folders or four-flap enclosures or used as photo corners. And heavyweight papers can be used for primary or secondary enclosures. Same with boards can be used for all level of enclosure. If you need to impart rigidity, they're very useful. So plastic comes in a variety of forms, in films, foams, and fabrics is how we use it for housing. Again, as with paper and board, you want to make sure that it passes the PAT test. You want to avoid any kind of plastics with coatings or additives because those can transfer over time to the photographic materials. You want to definitely avoid any plastics containing PVC, polyvinyl chloride, as that releases a lot of strong acids over time and can very actively deteriorate photographic materials. Now for clear plastic film, the thickness is usually measured in mils, which is 1/1000th of an inch. Generally for housing, we like to use between 3 and 5 mils, depending on the strength of plastic you need. Obviously, the thicker the plastic, the more expensive it will be. And the best plastics to use in your collections, starting from probably the most stable is polyester, which is sold under the brand name Maloney. It used to be called Mylar, but Mylar is no longer being manufactured as Mylar. Polyethylene and polypropylene. And those you commonly see as the kind of the sheets with the 3 holes punched in them for negatives and that sort of thing. You can also make foam out of polyethylene, which is sold under the trade names Volara and Ethafoam. Now, the Volara foam is very smooth and thin and flexible. The Ethafoam is very rough and thick and rigid. So here you see an image of the Volara foam on the left, and on the right is some Ethafoam that has been cut to create little indentations to place daguerreotypes that don't have covers on them anymore. There's also plastic fabrics, and all these fabrics are called non-woven or spun. And they're essentially felted plastic fibers. So there's Tyvek, which is made out of polyethylene, which is smooth and thin. You can get envelopes and tapes and those kind of things out of Tyvek. Holitex and Rime are both polyester, and where these might be especially helpful if you're doing housing is if you have any exposed tacky adhesive on photographs. These can be cut and placed over that tacky adhesive and keep it from sticking to adjacent objects and remain easily removable. So if at some point in the future you can have the adhesive removed by a conservator, they could do so without causing harm to the object. There's also a variety of formats that you can choose for your primary enclosures. The most obvious and easy to use and make are folders. Excuse me. They're also very space efficient. Now, if you're using folders, ideally you want to try to put no more than 10 items per folder. If you can, you want to try to put similar processes and similar sized items in a folder together. Obviously, the items should be slightly smaller than the folder. You don't want them to be extending outside the folder. And you don't necessarily want them to be swimming around in the folder either. Now, if it's possible to use subfolders or interleave the items, again, you're adding an additional layer of chemical and physical protection for the objects in the folder. Envelopes are also relatively inexpensive and provide good protection against abrasion. as they're sealed on 3 sides. Now, you want to avoid envelopes that have thumb holes or center seams. And this is because the thumb holes both expose a portion of the photograph, and I have seen examples of where that little half moon has become discolored. And they also promote kind of bad handling practices because it's one's inclination, I think, to reach in that thumb hole and pinch and pull, which you're much more likely to get handling creases in from grabbing something that way rather than knocking the photograph out and handling it by the edges. Now, with the center seams can also, in addition to being kind of right in the middle of the photograph, they also can provide kind of irregular pressure on the photograph. So the side seams in general are going to be a lot better in that the adhesive is isolated to the sides of the photograph. And of course you're using stable adhesives here. And it's a little more even pressure for the objects that are going to be housed in there. And it's a good idea too for when you're housing them to always make sure the emulsion is faced away from the seams. The seams are usually on one side or the other. It's just sort of an added level of protection. Now, 4-flaps enclosures I really like because I think that they promote good handling, because in order to open them, they need to be flat on a table, and then you open all 4 flaps, and then you can examine the object. They're also very nice because they're non-adhesive, so there's no worry about the quality of the adhesive or anything getting stuck. They provide excellent protection against abrasion. They're generally standard sizes. Excuse me. So that the object can't move around within them. They're also relatively easy to make in-house if you have the ability to make enclosures in-house. Now, plastic sleeves usually come as either an L sleeve, so meaning there's a one long and one short side that are sealed. These are very space efficient. The one issue is if you have fragile objects, sometimes that one tight corner down by the L can be somewhat difficult to, especially with thin papers, get an object far enough into that corner to protect it and remove it safely without causing any kind of damage to it. Now, plastic fold lock sleeves are safe to use with fragile objects because the sleeve is entirely open as you place the object face down into the sleeve and then close the back and lock it in place. However, because they have the flaps on them, they can sometimes be a little bit bulky with the added flaps, and the flaps can occasionally get caught on each other as well. Now, when you're using boxes, it's important to use spacers to avoid slumping and shifting inside the box. You also want to be careful not to overcrowd things. Having photographs under pressure can cause damage. And then you could think about whether it makes sense for you to use horizontal or vertical storage. Now, typically, vertical storage is a little more space efficient. Occasionally, you will have fragile objects that will benefit more from horizontal storage. So again, it's a sort of case-by-case basis what the best decision is going to be. So clamshell boxes for horizontal storage have a uniform sheet of board that goes from the base to the spine to the top, and objects can be slid across to be accessed. However, I find the drop front boxes to be a little bit easier to access materials because you can take them entirely out of the box without needing to dig your fingers in next to them and pull them out that way, which sometimes can cause damage. CMI boxes are a very good solution for photo albums because they can be manufactured to custom sizes. And a lot of photo albums are non-standard sizes, so this is a nice solution for those. Your typical vertical storage box is your flip-top box, which is quite space efficient. I prefer these to your standard banker's boxes. I think they actually are more space efficient and they're a little easier to access too because there's fewer materials in them. So considerations for what kinds of enclosures to use is to think about handling and to try to encourage good handling through design. You know, who's going to be handling them? What kind of training do the people handling them have? What kind of supervision do they have? How often will these objects be handled? And what are the vulnerabilities of the individual object? And then, again, obviously, budget comes into major consideration. And you need to think about the cost of the materials versus the labor, space, supplies, and expertise for making enclosures in-house. A lot of times it can be a lot more cost-effective to make things in-house, but you need to have the ability to store the supplies and to have the space in order to make them. So just as a comparison, if you were to buy 25 pre-made folders, they'd be $1.81 each. If you were to make them from a roll of folder stock, they would only be 50 cents each. However, the upfront cost is a lot greater to buy the folder stock on a roll, which would be $327 versus the $45.25 to buy the pre-made folders. So it sort of depends on how many folders you think you're going to need, and again, having the space and expertise to make them in-house. So the more layers of protection, the better. If you can put, say, for example, a piece of microchamber paper which has zeolites in it behind an object in a polyester L sleeve, and then put that in a cardstock folder inside a box, you'll be adding levels of protection that are going to help to keep that object safe from the environment. You want to think about having high quality in all levels, from the primary enclosure to the outer box, and think about what makes sense for your specific collection. So part of thinking about what makes sense for your specific collection is really having an understanding of that collection. Some of you may have already done this, but an important first step is doing a collection survey to sort of establish your priorities. And in that survey to identify fragile and sensitive materials, important materials, any high-use items, and the current state of the enclosures that they are in. And to evaluate that current state, there's a lot you can do through just using your own senses. The feel, you can easily feel when paper is becoming weak and brittle. Any kind of plastics that are sticky and greasy definitely should go. You want to look at things, if you see paper that is discolored, plastics that are discolored, plastics also that may become distorted as they deteriorate. And also you can sometimes smell the deterioration products off-gassing. So anything with a strong acrid odor is probably actively deteriorating. The final test is pH pens, which I don't know if anyone here has used them, but I mean, it's literally a litmus test. So you can see next to the image of the pH pen here, there's a purple line and a yellow line. So the pH pen, if something is neutral or alkaline, it'll be purple, and if it's acidic, it'll be yellow. So it's kind of a quick test. You know, keep in mind it's making a permanent mark, so you want to make sure that you're using it judiciously. But if you just need to assess some of your enclosures, it can be a nice quick way to do that. Now, if you are moving your objects into new enclosures, you're going to want to make sure any kind of information is transferred from the old enclosure onto the new enclosure. If you can simply transcribe it in pencil, that's great. Sometimes things will come in original enclosures that may have images or extensive information on them that you want to capture that would be too difficult or long to capture by hand. Those can often be photocopied or scanned and printed with toner either directly onto the new enclosure or onto a piece of high quality paper that could be put in with the photograph. Now, when we're thinking about exhibiting objects, in addition to temperature and relative humidity, which are things we always want to be aware of, we want to think about the light damage that they're going to receive. Now, when conservators are thinking about light damage, it's cumulative and it's irreversible, and the overall exposure is calculated by the intensity of exposure and the length of exposure. So here you see an example of two different exhibition scenarios. One has a photograph exhibited at 3 foot candles, which is quite dim, but that photograph can be exhibited for 10 months at 10 hours a day and get a 9,000 total foot candle hours. Whereas if you had something exhibited at 10 foot candles, which is a more kind of usual brighter intensity, that could only be exhibited for 3 months to get the same total amount of exposure. And it's a good idea if you are exhibiting objects to try to track how much exposure they're getting and making sure no one item is getting too much exposure. Facsimile prints can be very useful for that. If you're exhibiting objects for the image content only, then I would highly recommend using high quality facsimile prints because they will be able to convey the message that you're trying to convey through the photograph. However, there are times when a photograph will have certain artifactual value for whom it belonged to or the history of that specific object where you will want to be exhibiting the original object. Now, of the vast spectrum of light that exists, ultraviolet light is especially damaging. So it's good to put in precautions to limit the amount of ultraviolet light that your object is receiving. One of the easiest ways of doing this is using an ultraviolet filtering glass or acrylic glazing. So the standard enclosure for exhibition is a frame. You have a mat board backing and a window mat or spacers to separate the object from the glass. Now, glass and acrylic can both be UV filtering, kind of some of the pros and cons between choosing glass or acrylic. Now, glass, obviously, it's very breakable and it's very heavy, but it is less expensive than acrylic, generally speaking. So if you are going to be traveling a piece, I would definitely recommend using the acrylic because the risk of breakage is too high. But if you're going to be handling something in-house and not handling it often, then glass is appropriate. Something to keep in mind with acrylic, though, is that it does have some flexibility. So if you are housing any kind of oversized photographs, you're going to want to make sure that the space you have between the object and the acrylic will accommodate any kind of bowing that might happen in the center of the frame. So this is a diagram of a typical example of a photographic object hinged to a window mat. So hinging is something that should really only be done by someone who's a professional, who's had experience and training in using wheat starch paste and Japanese paper applied to the back of the photograph. Anytime you're applying moisture to a photograph, there's always a risk for damage. So you want to make sure that whoever's doing that has the right credentials to be doing that. And then ideally, you could also be using non-adhesive attachments, such as photo corners made out of paper. They're very easy to make in-house, and they won't cause any damage to the photograph, or shouldn't if they're properly used. So the top image is just a simple photo corner that's taped down, and then the bottom image shows a sort of a reusable, openable photo corner, which is just a square of paper that's folded horizontally and vertically. So when you have a window mat on top of that corner, it'll hold it closed, but then once you remove the window mat, you could easily open the corner, take the photograph out, and then replace it back in there if it's going to be returned in there afterwards. Another type of non-adhesive attachment are edge strips, which are especially good for oversized or fragile objects because they fully support all the edges. This is a technique that was invented by Hugh Phibbs and is outlined in the article mentioned here if you want to get more specifics on how to make them. And so when using pressure-sensitive tapes, I just want to stress that you should never use them in direct contact with the object, regardless of what the manufacturer says. I know sometimes they're sold as document mending tapes, but they tend to do a lot more damage than any help they do. But they're perfectly fine to apply over corners or when you're hinging housing materials together, that sort of thing. They're fast and easy to apply, but they do gain in tack over time. They're not easily reversible. To reverse them, you almost always need heat and solvent. The common ones that are used in conservation to make housings are Thermoplast P90, which has a white paper carrier, Tyvek tape, which is a Tyvek carrier, and then 3M makes a one-sided tape, the 850 with a polyester carrier, and a double-sided tape, 415 with a polyester carrier. Now, if you're going to be exhibiting things in a case as opposed to in a frame on a wall, you want to make sure that that case contains no formaldehyde and no materials that will off-gas or become acidic. Now, you can seal wood, provided you use 100% acrylic resin, and you can also use powder-coated metal, which is very stable. If you need to use any caulking, make sure it's a silicone caulk. And if you're using fabric to line the case, you want to use 100% cotton or linen fabric that has been washed and make sure that it has stable dyes, obviously. And then for any kind of newly constructed case or any time a new material goes in a case, you want to wait a minimum of 3 weeks before the object can go in to make sure that any new materials have been allowed to fully off-gas so that that won't affect the object. So in an exhibit case, if you can exhibit things perfectly flat, that's going to be the most stable for the object. If that's not possible, you want to try to keep the angle of exhibition as low as possible. You want to make sure that the back of the object is fully supported and protected from whatever material it's on, and make sure the objects are secured. Even if you're not in an earthquake zone, people will walk into exhibit cases and can jostle things around, so you just want to make sure that no damage will happen if that happens. Again, ideally, you'd be using non-adhesive attachments. They do make a UV filtering polyester film, so if you have media that you're concerned about, you can cut a piece to the size of the object and place it on top of the object within the case to help protect it from UV light. And so I'll just talk about some specific guidelines for some specific types of photographs. So cased images, which are daguerreotypes, ambrotypes, or tintypes, are called cased images because they're often in a case. Now the best way to, the cases tend to be very prone to abrasion, so you do want to have some kind of primary enclosure to protect the case. A 4-flap enclosure made out of cardstock is very good, though you can do a simple paper wrapper as well. You want to try, if you can, to keep them stored vertically. It's much more space efficient. And if you do, for some reason, have to store them horizontally, I would recommend storing them face down. And that's because the historic glasses have a tendency to deteriorate, and the deterioration products are very alkaline. And if they collect on the inside of the glass and fall onto the object, they will cause damage. So if they're face down, you'll prevent that from occurring. If you are exhibiting them, you want to be very aware of the spine opening and make sure that it has a gentle opening and it's not being forced open as you would with a book. Now, single-layer paper-based photographs, so these are photographs that don't have a binder, are cyanotype salt prints and platinum prints. Because there is no binder, they're all very sensitive to abrasion. So when choosing materials to house them in, you want to make sure that they are smooth and that they are not going to be shifting inside those materials. Cyanotypes and salt prints are very light sensitive, and I would say they probably should never be exhibited. If they are exhibited, you can, probably you've seen this where you put a little curtain in front of it so that the viewer has to lift the curtain to look at it, which does help really limit the amount of light that it's receiving. Platinum prints, you want to be careful about what objects you're storing near them because they will transfer. The platinum metal that makes up the image of the print actually acts as a catalyst to accelerate paper deterioration. So the image you see here is showing a platinum print that was housed in a card folder with a piece of tissue on top of it, and that tissue has the mirror image of the platinum print. So 2- and 3-layer paper-based photographs are photographs that do have a binder layer. Albumin prints will most likely be mounted. And with mounted prints, oftentimes the mounts are going to be very fragile. And so you want to try to house them in a way that is going to protect the mount as well as the photograph on the mount. So you need to account for the depth and shape of the mount. Now certain types of mounts, such as those for stereo views, will be intentionally concave so that when you're viewing them, you get the full 3D effect. Other mounts over time will have become unintentionally concave. But you still, you want to respect that because if you try to flatten them, they'll most likely break. For small mounted photographs, it's actually best to store them vertically because the least amount of pressure will be put onto the mount and the least risk for it breaking. If they are oversized, you can store them horizontally, but you want to make sure that you're not stacking too many in a box together because, again, you want to be very aware of the pressure and the potential for breakage. If you have ones that are highly valuable, I would suggest putting them in a sink mat, and I have an example of that which I can show you. Collodion prints are very sensitive to abrasion. They're usually mounted, so they're similar kind of mount issues to the albumin prints. But because they're so sensitive to abrasion, you want to be a little more cautious with making sure that you're using interleaving and trying to apply primary enclosures if you can. Silver gelatin prints are fine to store in folders or sleeves. They can be stored horizontally or vertically, whatever is going to work best in your collection, assuming that they are in otherwise stable condition. Same thing for chromogenic prints. Now, transparent film, if you have anything on nitrate and acetate, these should be very much red flag materials. They have they're harmful off-gassing and have a tendency to, once they start to deteriorate exponentially. They will affect not only themselves, but any adjacent materials, so it's important to segregate them from other collection materials. Here's an area where using buffers or zeolites would be very helpful. And if you can, you want to prioritize these for cold storage. And I've included a link here to the National Park Service website, which has a very good tutorial about preparing and setting up simple cold storage. Now, if you have transparent film on polyester, polyester itself is actually quite stable. So you can use a paper or a plastic enclosure and horizontal or vertical storage for these. Now, photographs on glass. Again, it's the same kind of issue you have with mounts. Ideally, you want to have vertical storage. If you have any oversized glass plates, horizontal storage is better, but again, you don't want to have too many together because you want to avoid having too much weight on that bottom plate. Make sure the boxes are well labeled, glass, heavy, fragile, so that anyone removing them from the shelf isn't going to be surprised at how much they weigh, because the glass weighs so much more than paper objects. Most glass plate negatives will be standard sizes, so you can buy standard size 4-flap envelopes to protect them, which are great. And so I'm just going to summarize some of the takeaways that I hope you all have from this, which is you want to make sure that the materials pass the PAT, that they're lignin-free, that they're 100% cotton rag or high alpha cellulose, 87% or higher. Avoid PVC, plastics with coatings, wood pulp, glassine, and adhesives. You want to use buffered materials with acetate and nitrate negatives, or prints with acidic mounts that you're concerned about. And avoid buffer materials with cyanotypes, diazotypes, and dye transfers. Trust your senses. If you feel like something isn't adequate, you're probably right. There's a lot you can tell just by looking at things. When you're ordering supplies, request samples from the suppliers. Most people are happy to send out samples, and you can evaluate them for yourself and see how they work with your collection. You want to know your collection and be creative. And stay in touch with me. I hope you took down my information, and since this presentation I don't know what your specific issues are, but I would be happy to address them if anyone wants to email me about any kind of specific questions or issues you have in your collection. Here are a couple slides of resources. And again, this presentation will be available online, so don't worry about copying these down now, but I just wanted to include them. And then the suppliers, just a short list of some of the suppliers that we use. And I'd like to invite you all up to the front of the room to look at some samples of different types of housings and answer any questions that anyone may have. Yeah. Okay, so this is a cardstock 4-flap enclosure for a daguerreotype case. Which is a good protective enclosure, but sometimes can be somewhat time-consuming to make. A simpler alternative might be just 2 pieces of paper that are cut and scored to wrap around the case, such as these. So this is something that would be easy to make in-house. And then another modification to the standard cardstock 4-flap. If you have a cased object that is missing the lid of the case, you can attach Volara foam to one of the flaps to serve as a cushioning lid for the case. And this is a modification so this is a piece of polyester film that has been double-sided taped to a tube-like mat board backing to protect the photograph from running into the double-sided tape. A thin string has been run along that edge of the tape so that the photograph cannot come into contact with the tape. This is an example of a non-adhesive spacer for putting inside a box, such as this small box. It's made by simply cutting and scoring a piece of corrugated board and putting in sort of teeth in the alternating directions so that when it's put together, it can lock. So if a box is not full, this will prevent the photographs from slumping inside the box. An example of having a double-sided mat. So this is on cardstock, so it's in a slight sink mat with some 5mm polyester around the edges to hold it in place. And then the back is also a window mat so that both sides can be viewed. a different version of a double-sided mat has this photograph, which doesn't have a backing but has the back cut as another window mat. And it is held, again, in a sink mat in a polyester sleeve that can be secured with some polyester flaps. This is a non-adhesive type of attachment where essentially it's a four-flap that has been cut to create a window on one side so that the object can be displayed in the window and then held in place without any adhesive. And here's some examples of various corners. Perhaps the most useful is this one, which can be reopened. So it's simply a square of paper that's been folded both vertically and horizontally. And now if an object was being held in here, this would be held closed by having a window mat on top of it. So this is an example of edge strips, which are good for large objects or objects with fragile edges that wouldn't be able to be adequately held in corners. So essentially it's a piece of paper that's slightly larger than the photograph, that's been cut at the corners and then folded like an accordion in over the edges of the photograph to hold it in place.